The universe is old, but humanity is still young. While other species have spent millennia perfecting war, diplomacy, and empire building, humans remain an anomaly, reckless, unpredictable, and driven by something that even the most advanced civilizations struggle to understand: sheer stubbornness. For centuries, the galactic powers waged war with cold efficiency, their soldiers bred for battle, their strategies calculated to perfection. But when an unexpected enemy emerged from the void, an enemy immune to logic, undeterred by fear, and relentless beyond comprehension, the old ways of fighting proved useless. The great empires faced extinction. Desperation drove them to search for a weapon, a force, a species capable of fighting without limits. They found humans. Not just any humans. The elderly. It started as a joke. A research team analyzing Earth's history noticed a pattern: older humans, those society deemed past their prime, were often the ones who had nothing left to lose. They were the ones who fought the hardest, who survived against all odds, who refused to fade quietly into irrelevance. Grandparents who lifted cars to save loved ones, war veterans who kept fighting despite impossible odds, retirees who had lived through decades of suffering and still laughed in its face. These were not the fragile remnants of youth the rest of the galaxy expected. These were survivors. The recruitment began in secret. Select individuals were offered a second chance, not just at life, but at strength. Advanced alien technology could restore their bodies, enhance their minds, and turn their hard-earned wisdom into the ultimate weapon. Arthritis? Gone. Heart disease? Cured. Weakness? Erased. What remained were warriors with a lifetime of experience and the unbreakable spirit of those who had already faced death and refused to bow. The newly formed Earth Veterans Corps entered the galactic stage with all the grace of a bar fight at a diplomatic summit. While other species relied on precise formations and carefully calculated maneuvers, the human seniors fought with pure, unfiltered audacity. They used tactics no alien strategist could predict: dirty tricks, gut instinct, and an uncanny ability to improvise under pressure. The enemy, a horrifying force known only as the Hollow, found itself on the defensive for the first time. No one expected the Earth veterans to win. No one expected them to laugh while doing it. The aliens struggled to understand how a squad of humans could hold a trench for 6 days straight with nothing but improvised weapons and sheer spite. How a 78-year-old man could charge into battle wielding a plasma cannon like a shotgun while cackling about his high school football days. How a former kindergarten teacher could disarm a 10-foot-tall warrior with a look that had once silenced a room full of screaming toddlers. But the veterans understood. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting because they finally had something worth fighting for. The military hadn't just restored their youth, it had given them purpose. In a society that had cast them aside, they had found a place where they mattered. Where their experience was not just respected, but necessary. And for the first time in history, the universe learned the true meaning of the phrase. Get off my lawn. The Hollow were unlike any enemy humanity or any other species had ever faced. They did not negotiate. They did not retreat. They did not even seem to die in a way that made sense. Their bodies, or what passed for them, were composed of a shifting, living darkness, a void that absorbed energy, matter, and even thoughts if one stared too long. The great empires of the galaxy had thrown fleets at them. Armadas of ships bristling with the finest weapons technology could forge. It hadn't mattered. The Hollow consumed everything, adapted, and came back stronger. But they had never faced old humans before. The first real victory came in the Battle of Driftpoint, where a small force of Earth Veterans Corps troops, barely a company's worth, held off an entire Hollow incursion force while the younger, more advanced alien armies fled. The aliens couldn't understand how it had happened. The battle reports made no sense. Apparently, the humans had used psychological warfare by taunting the Hollow with insults so absurd they bypassed the creature's ability to comprehend speech. One transcript described a 93-year-old grandmother standing on the front lines, shaking her fist at a towering hollow war form, screaming, "I survived raising 5 kids and 2 husbands. You oversized pile of bad decisions. You think you scare me?" The footage showed the hollow hesitating for the first time in recorded history. But it wasn't just attitude that won the day. The veterans fought dirty. They fought unpredictably. A squad of ex-construction workers turned their dropship into a battering ram, using it to plow through hollow formations. A retired magician used sleight-of-hand tricks mid-battle, confusing the enemy just long enough to take them down. A former chess grandmaster directed the fight like a campaign from a war centuries past, setting up feints and sacrifices that no AI or alien general could have ever anticipated. They didn't fight for glory. They didn't fight for medals. They fought because, for the first time in decades, they felt alive. Word spread. More and more elderly humans volunteered. Some were veterans of old wars, some had never held a weapon in their lives, but all of them carried something invaluable experience. The kind of experience that couldn't be taught, only earned through years of survival. The alien strategists, so used to their rigid doctrines, tried to keep up. They failed. Their war manuals didn't cover things like weaponized stubbornness or combat-effective nagging. They had no counter to the human ability to tell stories mid-battle, throwing off enemy morale with long-winded rants about back in my day or terrifying them with tales of human endurance. A hollow general once made the mistake of capturing a human squad. The next day, the prisoners were free, the enemy base was on fire, and the general had resigned after being subjected to a 14-hour lecture on the declining quality of modern music. By the time the battle for the galaxy reached its peak, the Earth Veterans Corps were no longer a joke. They were a legend. One particular hero, Sergeant First Class Mildred Millie Dawson, became a symbol of everything the Hollow feared. A former elementary school teacher, she took command of a battlefield with the same energy she had once used to wrangle unruly children. Entire enemy formations hesitated when she pointed at them and shouted, "You sit down and think about what you've done." Somehow, against all odds, it worked. Even the most hardened soldiers in the galactic community began adopting human-style combat techniques. The Jorvans, a species known for their cold, analytical approach to war, started incorporating gut instinct into their strategies, though they had to consult human mentors to figure out exactly how that worked. The Veltari, a proud warrior race that had previously dismissed ranged weapons as cowardly, found themselves embracing the fine art of shoot first, argue later after training with a Texan great-grandfather who had once won a bar fight using only a pocket knife and a bad attitude. The war reached its climax at the Battle of the Burning Rim. The Hollow, having learned that direct combat against the humans was a disaster, adapted. They stopped trying to overwhelm with numbers. They started using psychological warfare. They whispered into the minds of their enemies, filling them with despair, with fear, with regret. For the young, this was devastating. But for the elderly humans? They had already lived with those things for decades. When the Hollow tried to break the Earth Veterans Corps with visions of past mistakes, of lost opportunities, of the inevitable march of time, Millie Dawson simply laughed. "You think I don't know all that? You think I haven't lived with it every single day? You're going to have to do better than that, sweetheart." And then she pulled the trigger. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their strength. It wasn't their numbers. It wasn't even their technology. It was their ability to endure. By the time the war ended, the Hollow were not just defeated. They were changed. Something in them had shifted, altered by their encounters with the impossible resilience of the humans they had underestimated. No one knew what would become of them, but one thing was certain: no species in the galaxy would ever look at humanity the same way again. And as the Earth Veterans Corps returned home, their bodies still strong, their spirits unbroken, they realized something. They had started this war believing they were past their prime. They had finished it knowing they had never even hit their peak. The war was over, but for the Earth Veterans Corps, retirement was no longer an option. They had spent their whole lives being told their best years were behind them. That they were too old, too slow, too weak to make a difference. And yet, when the galaxy teetered on the brink of annihilation, it was the so-called relics of humanity who had turned the tide. The offers started rolling in almost immediately. The galactic empires, once so dismissive of human potential, now practically begged the veterans to stay. Some were offered command positions in elite military units. Others were invited to serve as advisors, their hard-won experience considered more valuable than any strategic AI. Entire planets wanted them as peacekeepers, diplomats, or even rulers because after seeing what these humans had accomplished, the galaxy had collectively decided that they wanted to be on their good side. The veterans, however, had other plans. They weren't done fighting. Not because they craved war, but because they had seen what lay beyond it: world suffering under tyrannical rule, civilizations on the edge of collapse, people who needed help but had no one willing to step up. They had already saved the galaxy once. Why stop there? And so, the Earth Veterans Corps did something unprecedented. They went independent. No longer bound to any government, they became a force unlike anything the universe had ever seen: a mercenary army that didn't fight for money, but for justice, for challenge, and sometimes, just because they were bored. Need a warlord overthrown? Call the veterans. Pirates harassing trade routes? The veterans will clear them out in an afternoon. An interstellar crime syndicate causing trouble? Well, good luck intimidating a squad of former grandmothers who had spent decades perfecting the art of the disappointed glare. The galaxy quickly learned that hiring the Earth Veterans Corps came with one very specific rule: you didn't get to dictate how they handled things. A corrupt planetary governor who thought he was hiring them to put down a rebellion found himself on the wrong side of his own army when the veterans decided the rebels were actually in the right. An alien warlord who offered them a fortune to wipe out a rival fleet woke up to find his entire base relocated, his ships, his weapons, even his furniture, all mysteriously gifted to the very enemy he was trying to defeat. The veterans did things their way. And their way was unpredictable, chaotic, and devastatingly effective. Of course, not everyone appreciated their methods. The galactic elite, the bureaucrats, the leaders who thrived on control, all saw the veterans as a problem. A force that didn't play by the rules, that answered to no one, that refused to fade into the background like they were supposed to. They tried to undermine them. Tried to discredit them. Tried to get rid of them. None of it worked. Because at the end of the day, the Earth Veterans Corps weren't just warriors. They were legends. And legends don't retire. Not when there's still work to be done. Not when there's still a universe that needs saving. Not when they've finally found their purpose. So they marched forward, laughing in the face of danger, defying the odds at every turn. Because the galaxy still hadn't learned the most important lesson of all. Never, ever underestimate old humans. The Earth Veterans Corps had become something more than just soldiers. They were symbols, myths in the making, whispered about in the farthest reaches of space. Parents told their misbehaving children stories of old humans who would appear in the night if they didn't clean their rooms. Criminal syndicates lived in terror of the seemingly unstoppable force of what the galactic underworld had come to call the Gray Tide. And yet, the veterans themselves didn't see what they did as legendary. To them, it was just common sense. When they saw injustice, they stopped it. When they saw suffering, they did something about it. And when someone tried to kill them, they made sure to return the favor with interest. One of their most famous campaigns, the so-called Tax Evasion War, started as a simple contract. The veterans had been hired to help stabilize a small colony world suffering under the rule of a corrupt megacorporation that had turned it into a near-slave labor camp. The officials in charge believed themselves untouchable, protected by legal loopholes and private armies. They hadn't counted on the veterans' particular brand of problem-solving. Instead of attacking directly, the old soldiers did what any retired person with decades of frustration toward bureaucracy would do: they audited the company's finances. Within weeks, they had uncovered enough evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion to bankrupt an entire sector. The megacorporation's leadership, realizing they were about to be financially annihilated, tried to strike first. It did not go well for them. The veterans responded by launching a coordinated campaign of what they referred to as mild retaliatory measures. These measures included, but were not limited to, seizing the company's main headquarters and replacing all security measures with aggressive attack drones programmed to demand retirement benefits for all employees, hacking their internal communications and replacing all official messages with lengthy newsletters about the importance of proper lawn maintenance, redirecting the company's off-world supply chains to an orphanage on a distant colony, leading to the accidental donation of billions of credits worth of supplies, ships, and high-tech weaponry to a group of confused but very grateful children, broadcasting a 17-hour-long lecture from Sergeant Mildred Dawson about the moral and ethical failings of corporate greed across every major news network in the galaxy. By the time the dust settled, the company no longer existed, the colony was free, and the veterans had somehow ended up owning a fleet of luxury starships which they promptly repurposed into a combination of mobile retirement homes and heavily armed assault carriers. The galaxy should have learned its lesson. It didn't. Time and time again, the veterans found themselves called upon to solve problems no one else could. A war between two rival empires threatened to engulf an entire sector. The veterans settled it in a week by forcing the two leaders to share a dorm room and do manual labor together until they worked out their differences. A mysterious ancient weapon was discovered deep in uncharted space. The veterans found it, dismantled it, and sold the parts to buy better coffee makers for their ships. The universe had never seen anything like them. And then the Hollow returned. No one expected it. No one thought it was possible. The war had been won. The enemy defeated. The galaxy had moved on. But the veterans knew better. They had seen it in their own history how evil never truly dies, how peace is never permanent, how the past always has a way of clawing back when you least expect it. The Hollow had learned. They had adapted. And they had come back stronger. This time, they didn't strike with brute force. They didn't attack in overwhelming waves. They whispered. They infiltrated. They turned allies against each other, using fear and paranoia as their weapons. Governments collapsed overnight. Armies crumbled before they could even take the field. The galaxy stood on the edge of destruction. But the veterans had been preparing for this. While the rest of the universe had celebrated their victory, the old humans had been watching. Studying. Waiting. Because deep down, they had always known. The Hollow weren't just an enemy. They were a test. And if there was one thing old humans knew how to do, it was ace a test. The final war began not with a battle, but with a single message broadcast across every system in the known galaxy. A message from Sergeant Mildred Dawson. The transmission showed her sitting in a well-worn armchair, sipping a cup of tea, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "You thought we'd just sit back and let you take everything we fought for?" she said, her voice calm but firm. "You thought we'd just roll over and let you win?" She set her tea down and leaned forward. "Well, guess what, sweetheart? We're still here." Across the galaxy, ships came online. Weapons powered up. The Earth Veterans Corps, the same ragtag group of so-called old relics who had once been dismissed as useless, stood ready for war once again. Because the Hollow had made a critical mistake. They had given humanity's elderly a reason to fight. And this time? They weren't planning on stopping until the job was done. The war began in silence. Unlike the first time, there were no grand invasions, no overwhelming swarms of Hollow darkening the skies. The enemy was patient now, slipping into the cracks of society, turning allies against one another, feeding off the fears they had carefully cultivated. Entire planets fell without a shot being fired. Governments tore themselves apart as paranoia took hold. Even the greatest warriors of the galaxy found themselves paralyzed by doubt, unable to trust their own minds. But the Earth Veterans Corps? They had already lived through worse. They had survived wars, betrayals, economic crashes, the slow erosion of time itself. They had spent decades watching people they trusted let them down, seeing institutions fail, witnessing the world change in ways they didn't always understand. And they were still here. So when the Hollow tried to turn them against each other, they simply laughed. When the enemy whispered lies into their minds, they rolled their eyes and tuned them out like an annoying radio station. When the darkness tried to seep into their ranks, it found itself met with the unshakable will of people who had already learned how to fight off their own demons. The Hollow weren't prepared for an enemy that had spent an entire lifetime resisting despair. The counterattack began in the ruins of a fallen colony world, where a single squad of veterans took back an entire city using nothing but old-fashioned guerrilla tactics and pure, stubborn grit. From there, the movement spread. Planets that had surrendered without a fight suddenly found themselves rising up, led by small teams of elderly human warriors who refused to give up. Whole fleets, once thought lost, reappeared commandeered by grizzled veterans who had spent their younger years fixing up old cars and saw no reason why a broken battleship should be any different. And then there was the Battle of Iron Hollow. The enemy had taken a vital stronghold, using it as the center of their psychological war. Every species in the galaxy had declared the planet lost, unwilling to risk another defeat. The veterans had other ideas. They didn't launch a conventional assault. They didn't storm the defenses in a grand military maneuver. Instead, they simply walked in. Unarmed. Unarmored. Just a group of elderly humans, strolling through enemy lines as if they were on a casual afternoon walk. The Hollow, confused but wary, hesitated. They didn't understand. These creatures should have been afraid. They should have cowered like all the others had. Instead, one of the humans, a retired librarian named Ruth, adjusted her glasses, looked up at the towering Hollow warlords, and said, "Now, are you going to behave, or do I need to get the wooden spoon?" Something happened that no one in the galaxy had ever seen before. The Hollow flinched. And in that moment, the veterans struck. They weren't faster. They weren't stronger. But they had something far more powerful, the ability to make their enemy hesitate. It was over in less than a day. The veterans took back the stronghold, not just through force, but through sheer psychological dominance. They broke the enemy's confidence, shattered the illusion of invincibility, made the Hollow feel, for the first time in their existence, something they had never truly understood: doubt. From there, the war turned. The veterans didn't just fight, they rewrote the rules of combat. They used tactics no one had ever considered before, because no one else had the same lived experience to draw from. An old pilot, once a racing champion in his youth, led an entire space battle using maneuvers based on 20th century Earth stunt flying. A retired con artist tricked a Hollow armada into surrendering to a fleet that didn't actually exist. A grandmother with a background in gardening discovered that a particular earth plant, when properly fermented, produced a scent that sent the Hollow into a state of panicked retreat. By the time the final battle arrived, the Hollow weren't just losing. They were afraid. And that was when the veterans knew they had won. Not because they had better weapons. Not because they had superior numbers. But because they had done what no one else had managed to do. They had made the Hollow doubt themselves. The war ended with a simple message. Another broadcast. Another quiet moment before history changed forever. This time, it wasn't Sergeant Mildred Dawson who spoke. It was a man named Gerald Haskins, former postal worker, amateur fisherman, and survivor of more nonsense than any reasonable person should have had to deal with in a single lifetime. He sat on the bridge of an old, battered warship, arms crossed, expression as unimpressed as if he were staring down a particularly stubborn neighbor who refused to return his borrowed tools. "This ends now," he said. "You can keep fighting, sure. But let's be honest, you're not gonna win." He leaned forward. You lot don't understand us. You never did. You tried to break us with fear, but we've been living with fear for decades. You tried to make us doubt ourselves, but doubt is just part of life. You thought you could make us give up? He chuckled. Buddy, we don't know how. Silence. And then, the Hollow spoke. Not with words, but with action. One by one, their ships powered down. One by one, they withdrew from occupied worlds. One by one, they surrendered. Because for the first time in their long, terrifying existence, they had encountered something truly unstoppable. Not youth. Not power. Not technology. But old humans. Who had seen worse. Who had lived through worse. Who had, after everything, decided that if the universe wanted to keep throwing problems at them, well, they just have to keep solving them. Because retirement? That was for quitters. The Hollow were gone. For the first time in galactic history, an enemy that had once seemed eternal, invincible, and inevitable had simply stopped. Not because they had been wiped out, not because they had been exterminated, but because they had been made to understand something fundamental. They could not win. Not against the old humans. Not against people who had lived long enough to see everything fall apart and still gotten up the next day to keep going. But peace was never simple. Because while the Hollow had retreated, the galaxy had changed. Entire governments had crumbled under the weight of their own fear. Whole sectors had been abandoned, left to lawlessness and chaos. There were power vacuums waiting to be filled, new dangers rising in the shadows, remnants of the war still lingering like the last embers of a dying fire. And the Earth Veterans Corps, the very same group who had once been dismissed as obsolete, found themselves in a strange and uncomfortable position. The galaxy was looking to them for leadership. The same bureaucrats who had once ignored them now wanted their advice. The same politicians who had considered them a liability now sought their guidance. The same armies that had once refused to recruit older humans now begged for their expertise. It was, in Gerald Haskins' words, an absolute headache. "This is why I never wanted to be in charge of anything," he muttered, rubbing his temples as yet another delegation of planetary leaders waited for their turn to speak. First, they don't want us. Now, they want us running the whole damn place. It's exhausting. You think that's bad? Sergeant Mildred Dawson scoffed, flipping through a datapad filled with diplomatic requests. Some of them want us to form a proper government. A human-led galactic council. Gerald gave her a horrified look. We just finished a war, Mildred. I'm too old for politics. We're too old for war, too, she said dryly. And yet, here we are. The veterans had never wanted to rule. They weren't conquerors, weren't politicians, weren't empire builders. They were just people who had spent their entire lives cleaning up messes that other people had made. And now, the galaxy was one big, stupid mess. Well, we can't ignore it, Ruth, the retired librarian, pointed out as she sipped her tea. If we don't do something, someone worse will step in. And then we'll have to clean up another mess later. Gerald groaned. So what, we become the new police force? The new peacekeepers? Just keep running around putting out fires until we keel over? The room was silent for a long moment. Then, Mildred Dawson chuckled. Isn't that what we've been doing all along? And so, the Earth Veterans Corps did not disband. They did not retire. They did not take control of the galaxy. Instead, they became something new. Something no one had ever seen before. They called it the Watch. Not an army. Not a government. But a presence. A force that moved through the stars, stepping in when they were needed, vanishing when they weren't. A group of people who had already proven that they didn't want power, didn't crave control, only solutions. And the galaxy, weary and battered, welcomed them. Not because they were human. Not because they were warriors. But because they had become something greater. They had become the guardians of history, the keepers of wisdom, the last, stubborn line of defense against chaos. They had become the elders of the universe. And as long as there were problems to solve, as long as there were battles to fight, as long as there was a need for the steady hands of those who had already lived through the worst and come out the other side, the watch would remain. Because retirement? Retirement was for people who didn't have a job to do. And as long as the stars still burned, as long as there was still a single fool out there making a mess of things, the old humans would keep showing up. With experience. With wisdom. And, if necessary, with a very large stick. Because some lessons, as every grandparent knows, require a little extra persuasion. The watch had no headquarters. That was the first thing they decided. No single homeworld, no Grand Council chambers, no central fleet docked around some fortress planet. They moved constantly, spread out across the stars, appearing where they were needed and disappearing just as quickly. It made them nearly impossible to track. It also made them a legend. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the watch had infiltrated every major government, that any leader foolish enough to abuse their power would wake up one morning to find an old human sitting in their office, sipping tea and explaining, in a deeply disappointed tone, why they were about to have a very bad week. Others swore the watch could dismantle entire crime syndicates with nothing but a strongly worded letter and a glare that could curdle milk. The reality was both simpler and far more terrifying. Because while the watch operated in secrecy, they weren't spies. They were fixers. They saw problems, and they solved them. Sometimes that meant training local defense forces, teaching them tactics long forgotten by the younger species. Sometimes it meant slipping into a corrupt government and politely encouraging a resignation. And sometimes, when there was no other choice, when words and warnings weren't enough, the watch reminded the galaxy why humanity's elderly had once brought the hollow to their knees. They weren't warriors. They were something worse. They were people who had spent a lifetime learning exactly what would make someone regret their choices. And they had all the time in the world to be patient. The first real test of the new mission came on a planet called Valtrix 9. A former industrial hub, now a lawless wasteland overrun by mercenary groups and warlords. The kind of place where good people tried to leave, and bad people made sure they never could. The local population had given up hope. No outside force had been able to reclaim the planet. Every attempt at peace had ended in failure. Until one day, an old woman with a walking cane walked straight into the largest mercenary stronghold, took a seat in the middle of the courtyard, and started knitting. The mercenaries were confused. Then they were annoyed. Then, as their weapons started jamming, their security systems failed, and their supply lines mysteriously collapsed, they became afraid. Because by the time they realized what was happening, the entire operation had already been dismantled. The woman, her name was Beatrice, former schoolteacher, hadn't lifted a finger in violence. She had simply brought along a few helpful friends from the watch. A retired engineer who had disabled their weapon caches, a former logistics officer who had rerouted their food shipments off-world, and a very determined ex-detective who had sent a detailed list of every single crime they had ever committed to every bounty hunter in the sector. Within a week, the warlords were gone. Within a month, the people of Valtrix 9 were rebuilding. And by the end of the year, the world had been transformed into a thriving, independent republic with an official policy of maintaining a small guest house for any member of the watch who happened to pass through. Word spread. Other lawless worlds, struggling colonies, and broken governments started seeing strange visitors. A retired plumber who somehow managed to take down an entire pirate fleet by sabotaging their water filtration systems. A former accountant who single-handedly unraveled an intergalactic financial conspiracy by doing what accountants did best, finding inconsistencies. The watch had no single method. They adapted. They solved problems the way only people with a lifetime of experience could. And the galaxy, for the first time in centuries, began to change. It wasn't fast. It wasn't perfect, but it was happening. Not through war, not through conquest, but through the quiet, relentless work of those who had already lived through enough chaos to know how to clean up after it. The younger species, still struggling to understand, asked how the Watch decided where to intervene. There was no grand strategy, no universal rule. There was only this. When one of them heard about a problem and muttered, "Well, that just won't do," the rest of the Watch knew it was time to move. And so they did. Because retirement? Retirement was a myth. At least for them. They had a galaxy to fix. And they weren't done yet.